Okay, good evening everyone. Buenas tardes a todos y bienvenidos al Museo del Canal. Welcome to the Panama Canal Museum. Mi nombre es Ana Elizabeth González, soy la directora ejecutiva del Museo del Canal y tengo el honor de presentar hoy a la doctora Julie Green, que nos acompaña en este conversatorio. My name is Ana Elizabeth González. I am the executive director of the Panama Canal Museum, and it is my honor tonight to introduce you all to Dr. Julie Green, who's going to be with us in this talk tonight. Para los que necesitan traducción simultánea al español, afuera tenemos el aparatito para conectarse a la traducción que estará sucediendo durante el evento, ya que el evento se va a llevar en inglés. Así que si no han agarrado una, pueden hacerlo en este momento. Okay, well, I think everybody's ready. Well, Julie, it's amazing to have you here. I'm going to have to obviously present your biography because it's incredible, but I can't begin without saying how much of an honor it is to have you at the museum finally, after we've talked about it for so long. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for presenting your most recent book. For those of you who do not know Julie, Julie Green is an award-winning historian and professor of the United States, of U.S. and global history at the University of Maryland at College Park. Julie's work focuses on uncovering the hidden history of working people and immigrants. She received her BA from the University of Michigan and MA from the University of Cambridge as a Power Foundation Fellow, and a PhD from Yale University. Her work in labor and immigration history has benefited from fellowships, including the National Endowment of the Humanities and the American Council of Learned Societies. Dr. Green is the author or editor of 5 books, including The Canal Builders, Making America's Empire at the Panama Canal, 2009, which received the Organization of American Historians James A. Rowley Prize for the best book on the history of race relations. In 2025, she published Box 25, Archival Secrets, Caribbean Workers, and the Panama Canal of UNC Press. In 2022, she co-edited the book Global Labor Migration, New Directions of University of Illinois Press. Dr. Green's recent articles include Rethinking the Boundaries of Class, Labor, History and Theories of Class and Capitalism, published in Labor Studies in Working Class History in 2021. Dr. Green has served on the advisory board for several documentary films, including The Panama Canal for American Experience on PBS, and has written for a range of media outlets on politics, labor, and immigration. Most recently, she published Trump's talk of the Panama Canal into Old Myths About the U.S. Power in January 22, 2025 at time.com and in La Prensa. She is currently a distinguished lecturer of the Organization of American Historians, and in 2025 received the University of Maryland's Distinguished Scholar Teacher Award. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Julie Green.
Thank you so much. I am so honored to be back at this beautiful museum. Greetings, everybody. Thank you so much for coming.
And for those listening at home, because we're live streaming from our YouTube channel, so hello as well. So let's get right to it, because I know there's a lot of people that also want to ask you questions, so I'll ask a few and then let everybody join. Your work has consistently focused on uncovering the lives of workers and migrants, often left out of official histories. So what first drew you to the Panama Canal as a site through which to explore global labor, empire, and migration?
Right. Yeah, I was trained as a U.S. labor historian, but there are really 2 causes. One is intellectual, that my work in U.S. history, I always felt like U.S. history is somewhat provincial. U.S. citizens often forget that there's other countries unless they want to be tourists. And I wanted to go and study something beyond the territorial boundaries, traditional boundaries of the U.S., and think about how U.S. power globally was interconnected with issues of labor and migration. The other reason, the personal reason, was when I was about 14 years old, my mother, who was I grew up in a town of 500 people in Nebraska, and my mother was a Democratic Party activist. And in 1977, she was invited to the White House, excuse me, to meet with Jimmy Carter, because he really believed that if he could just explain to Americans why it was important to transfer the canal to Panama, everybody would understand and accept it. And so she was flown to the White House. She met Jimmy Carter. She came home and lectured to her church and other societies about the Panama Canal. And I think that just planted in my head the canal and what was the deal with it. And it made me want to know much more.
Amazing. It's something that we've at the museum not only reference constantly from your work, but also in our day-to-day practices. So I'm glad that your mom was invited. In Box 25 specifically, you center a collection of testimonies submitted to the Isthmian Historical Society. What is Box 25 for those who don't know about it? And why did this particular archive change the way you understood the canal and its workers?
Sure. So Box 25 is a box held at the Library of Congress. It really should be here in Panama, of course, but that's a different matter. It was collected by the Isthmian Historical Society, which was a Zonian organization. There was a young white female librarian who thought it was important to collect the stories of people who actually worked on the canal while they were still there with us. There was a lot happening in Panama to celebrate the 50th anniversary, and she thought the workers from the Caribbean, their stories should be gotten down. So she held a competition for the best true story of life and work on the Panama Canal. 113 people entered the competition, mostly men, and they made their way finally into the Library of Congress. They really are the best first-person source we have for what Caribbean workers experienced, what they thought of the work building the canal, what they thought of the Americans. So I thought it would be interesting to just write a short book that focused on them. I wanted to understand the West Indian community more. My first book, Canal Builders, really told the whole story of the canal, and I felt like there was much more to understand about the Caribbean Panamanians.
And I just love how your latest book works with archive that reshapes spaces, because many people imagine archives as neutral repositories, and Box 25 shows them as spaces shaped by power, silences, and chance. What surprised you most when working with these materials?
The testimonies are really beautiful. You know, they're complicated to analyze because the people in question were themselves in a complicated position. They were facing exploitation and racism from the United States. Their place within the Republic of Panama was also difficult and challenged. They were living amidst different empires, different labor programs. And so to analyze them, I had to really think about why they were writing, who they were writing for, how they expressed what they experienced, and also what they left out, you know, the silences of the documents as well. So that surprised me, just how frank they were about racism and injustice, but at the same time, the way they expressed the way they express their pride in the work. They knew that what they were doing was earth-shatteringly important.
No pun intended. One of the most powerful aspects of the book is, as you mentioned, how Caribbean workers speak in their own voices. What do these testimonies reveal that traditional historical narratives have failed to capture, would you say?
Right. I think to some degree that just that complexity I was talking about, they were not shy about describing the racism they faced. They talked about their bosses using the N-word. They talked about feeling, one of them said, men die every day, and all the bosses care about is let's get the work done. They wanted to, yellow fever had been conquered by the time the US started its project. Malaria was still around, especially for the West Indian workers. And so almost all of them, at some point mentioned malaria. It's also really, there's a transcript of the testimonies available online, but it was really important for me to see them in person. Some of them, to see their handwriting, to see what it looked like, some of them would sketch pictures of where they lived, or one of them found a shark tooth and had it turned into a necklace. That was kind of one of the greatest prizes for canal workers, a shark tooth from when you didn't need a canal to connect the oceans. And so someone drew a picture of that, how proud he was when he would go home and visit Barbados and be able to wear his long trench coat and that shark tooth. So just little details like that really brought their lives to life for me. And that was really one of my main goals in writing the book, was just to try to bring individual lives to life. So often when officials then, and even historians since, talk about the West Indian workers on the canal, they tend to, it becomes kind of a nameless mass. I wanted to understand how different the Barbadians were from the Jamaicans, from the Antiguans, etc., and think much more about what their lives were like.
And previously you mentioned silences as well, and I was wondering, were there moments when absences or what was left unsaid became as meaningful as what was recorded?
Yeah, absolutely. The testimonies are fascinating and wonderful, but they are limited. They don't talk very much about their personal lives. They don't talk about religion, which we know was extremely important. They don't talk much at all about leisure activities. Unfortunately, those parts of their lives are difficult to learn much about. But, what the book really does is it analyzes the testimonies in box 25, but then I was always dying to find the personnel records that the US government kept on its workers. I had seen the personnel files for the gold workers, the white Americans in the canal zone, but to my knowledge, no historian before me had ever looked at the Caribbean workers' personnel records. So I went to St. Louis, Missouri, where they're kept, and I tracked down as many of the riders in box 25 as I could find, and I found about 2/3 of them, which allowed me to think about, both what their testimonies said, what they experienced, but then how the government surveilled them and tracked them and fought against them at times, and how they pushed the government. So I learned a lot about how they shaped the isthmus and how they resisted by comparing those two different kinds of documents.
And I love that a key goal of your book is to bring individual stories to life. You mentioned in the dedication of your book Constantine Parkinson as a particularly powerful story. Could you introduce him to us and share why his life became so central to your book?
Sure, yeah. First, let me just show a few pictures, sort of comparing the lives of the West Indian workers, also called the silver workers. So when we talk about bringing individual people's lives to life, I look at this young man, and I think about the different emotions he's expressing. We don't know his name, but we know we can look at his face and think about what he has to tell us. He looks anticipatory. He looks kind of excited, but kind of trepidatious as well, a little bit, hesitant, not sure what he's going to find as he shifts from the world of the British Empire to the US and Panama. So just some quick pictures. You all know, I'm sure, about the silver and gold segregation system, the commissary here with the different doors for silver versus gold reminds us of the almost Jim Crow-like segregation that was used in the Canal Zone. This gives a good sense of the just absolute horrendous dangers that face the workers. The dining for Afro-Caribbeans versus the white US citizens is depicted quickly in this image. The Caribbean workers would receive their food out of, the guy who cooked their food for them said, we feed them the same way we feed our hogs back home in the Midwest, just out of a big trough. They didn't have places to sit during the torrential rainfalls. They'd sit under a tree versus a cafeteria with ice and salt on the table for the white Americans. Housing, of course, also very different in a region where malaria, mosquitoes are still everywhere. Much of the silver worker housing had no screens on the windows. And then there's the work. And I love this image. The Panama Canal Zone, the industrial establishments were some of the most modern in the world. And you see here white US workers in front, but backed up by an army of Caribbean workers. One of the things I discovered doing this research was how many Caribbean workers actually achieved some degree of mobility. By the time the canal was finished being constructed, more Caribbean workers possessed some skill than did not. So we think of them often as the diggers, the laborers, but in fact, they were carpenters, plumbers, electricians. They weren't paid the same. They would do often the exact same job as the white US citizen, but of course, they'd be referred to as helpers and wouldn't make the same amount of money. So this brings me to Constantine. When I was writing my first book, his story really stuck with me. He was born on the Isthmus of Panama, across the bay from Cologne, because his father was a Jamaican who migrated here to work on the French canal project. He started working when he was about 13 years old. He changed jobs, slowly worked his way up by the time he was 19 to a job as a train man, a brakeman on the railroad. And when he was 19, there was a train accident and his leg was crushed. He was rushed to the hospital. They had to amputate his leg and part of his other foot. And he described in his testimony in box 25 what he saw when he woke up from the surgery. He said, and this is what just stuck with me, this image, he said, all around me, standing around my bed, were workers without a hand or a finger or an arm or an eye, all standing around to console me and say, my young man, you're a good soldier. You're going to be all right. And I thought, wow. One reason I wanted to get into the personnel records was to learn about people like Constantine, what happened to him. And here's the government personnel record for him. You can see here what kind of information they record. They have his picture as a young man. He was out of work for a year and then was given an artificial leg. The government at first said they had no job for him because of his disability. So he pushed back. He asked to visit Chief Engineer George Washington Gettles. And he said, as you see here, I need a job. My mother, I care for my mother, my grandmother. He made a strong case and he got a job. He ended up working for the US Canal for another 40 or more years. And I learned from the personnel records, he fought back. He fought to get a new artificial leg whenever the technology improved. He fought for better jobs. He joined his union. He became a respected union leader. He invented a new device for recording information. Finally, he retired in 1957, then lived another almost 35 years as a retired man, didn't have a lot of money, struggled. This is Constantine as an older man. He's featured in a film, The Diggers, which you can still find, I think, on YouTube by Roman Foster, made in the mid-1980s. It's wonderful to see these canal workers come to life and tell you about their lives. So, you know, Constantine is just one man who I wanted to know more. I came to care about what his life was like. And luckily, these different archives allowed me to understand him better.
And from what you've mentioned, with Fran Williams's help, you visited Constantine Parkinson's grave at Corozal Cemetery. And you've noted how the physical landscape still carries traces of past inequalities, including the contrast between silver worker cemeteries and the neighboring American cemetery. What did that moment reveal to you about memory, dignity, and what societies choose to preserve?
You know, when I was writing Box 25, I wanted to understand how archives are being created today. And I had the good fortune of being connected to both Fran Williams and Arcelio Hartley, both of whom are here in the audience with us today. Hi there, Fran and Arcelio. And so I came a year and a half ago, I came to be with them when a new memorial was being inaugurated at Corozal Cemetery, and Fran helped me find Constantine Parkinson's grave. And probably many of you have been to the cemetery. Much of it is not well maintained. I thought I might sprain an ankle just walking around looking for the grave. It took us quite a bit of time to find it. And when I did find it, oops, I must have deleted a picture. When I did find the grave, all it was a stone with a number on it. And I thought, you know, from the personnel record I showed you, they were made to hold up a number. And one of them I saw in the archives refused to hold up a number, said it made him feel like a slave. So it was very powerful to see the grave and to see that just a number. The family probably didn't have enough money. So I know that Fran is now working to do a proper way of honoring him. So to see that, to see the silver worker cemetery in such bad condition, and right next door to it is the American cemetery, which is owned by the United States, which was for the gold workers, and it's, you know, perfectly groomed, very beautiful, as beautiful as Arlington Cemetery in the United States. It made me think a lot about how the power the United States held has left permanent scars on the landscape. And you can see it when you see the two cemeteries, but you know, you can also see it when you look at the statistics on poverty in Panama, when you look at who's discriminated against, who has power and who does not. The legacies of imperialism are very much around us today.
Absolutely. And I think one of the aspects that your work does so well is placing the Panama Canal within global history of labor and migration. How does seeing the canal through this global lens change how we understand Panama's place in the world?
I think, you know, this is one of the things I love about Panama, is that it is a global country. It is a country shaped by global capitalism and furthering global capitalism. So I think when we consider it as a part of global history, we see that it's not just exceptional, but it is kind of the center. You know, the way it reshaped trade, military, commerce. You know, the world we know today of global capitalism is hard to imagine without Panama.
Thank you. You have water next to you as well, by the way, if you need it. One thing I found especially moving in Box 25 is that you follow the writers across the 20th century through aging, work, retirement, and also Panama's long struggle to liberate itself from the U.S. hegemony and to confront injustices towards Caribbean Panamanians and Afro-Panamanians. How did their lives intersect with the broader political transformations that we see?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really important to think about. As important as the canal was, I didn't want to stop with the construction. I wanted to think about these people's lives in the decades that followed. And that brings up a really important point about the writers in Box 25 are not typical canal workers, because even though when they did the competition, they advertised it across the Caribbean and Central America, most of those who wrote were people who had continued working for the canal. So, you know, when we think about silences, it's also important to realize that this was a small group that stayed in Panama and was lucky enough to continue working for the Canal Zone government. The story would be different if we followed, as some scholars have, followed them back to Barbados or Jamaica or moving onward to the US, because scholars have found that they were achieved some degree of mobility, social and economic mobility in Barbados, Jamaica, or New York. Once I gave a talk in New York City at a Caribbean festival, and someone was there whose grandfather had worked on the canal. And they said, we moved here, we struggled, we worked hard. We now own a brownstone in Brooklyn that's worth $3 million. So their story is quite different. But I think, let's see, what was the question?
So how did their lives intersect with broader political transformation globally?
Back to Panama. So the thing is about the Caribbean workers and the community and its history is they had to fight kind of a three-pronged fight. They had to resist the US government, which was exploiting them and was, you know, racially just highly discriminatory. They also shared in Panama's Panamanians' desire to liberate itself from U.S. power and to achieve sovereignty. But they also faced in Panama itself, anti-West Indian sentiment and discrimination. And in fact, Panama, I'm sure you all know this, Panama was complicated that way because often the anti-Americanism was really merged with anti-Afro-Caribbeanism, right? Saying that people from the British Caribbean were a threat to the Hispanic culture of Panama. So as the decades went by, the 20s and 30s, as a group like Acción Comunal came into being, their heads must have been swimming sometimes, figuring out which fight to fight. Push the US government, push the Panamanian government, educate the Panamanians around them. It was very complicated. So this is all sort of conjecture. The documents in Box 25, none of the people who wrote in Box 25 became big activists taking on the Panamanian government. But by looking at the work of other scholars like Keisha Coronialdi, Panama in Black, Marixa Lasso, who's here today too, by looking at what other scholars have done to show us the history of Panama, I've been able to sort of imagine what their lives were like.
It's something that always rattles me, and I wanted to ask you, why do you think these histories remain marginalized for so long, both locally and internationally? Do you think it's because they defy this image of development that the U.S. has created around itself? Or could you elaborate on why you think they remain marginalized for so long?
It's really interesting because they are marginalized and yet celebrated at the same time. But the celebration is always sort of en masse, and it remains somewhat superficial, I think. I think it has to do with power. Who has power even still today, and who does not? Whose stories matter? One of the things I love about history is that as a historian, you have the opportunity to try to bring to life the stories of people who are marginalized and being ignored. And in a book like Box 25, that was very much my goal.
And as historians and museums increasingly rethink whose stories are told, and as you were saying, diversify their own narrative, what responsibilities do you think institutions have when presenting histories shaped by inequality and empire?
Well, I think, this museum, along with the West Indian Museum that Arcelio Hartley directs, I think those both are so important to bring these stories to life. I had a wonderful tour of some of the new exhibitions you've done here, and there is something very special about the way a museum tells a story. The combination of seeing or maybe even touching artifacts combined with information that reveals a new world to people. I think it's important and exciting. And I think, in the US, we are facing, somebody trying to say that museums cannot cover certain things. I have been part of a group called Citizen Historians that went to every museum in the Smithsonian and took a photograph of every single thing there so that we can track what gets changed.
Or erased.
Yeah, absolutely. So that just right there tells you how important museums are, that some people see them as a threat. And it makes it all the more important that museums tell the hard stories as well.
Well, thank you for doing that. I can't imagine how difficult times museums are having in the United States right now. I also wanted to ask you, and I know there's questions from the public, so I'm nearly done, I promise. I wanted to ask you, what does it mean to bring archival research like yours into public spaces, whether it's museums, conversations, communities, rather than keep it in only in academia?
Yeah, it's something I've been committed to ever since I started working on the Panama Canal. Before that, I really wrote for other academics, but I remember talking to somebody who said to me, "You're writing a book about the Panama Canal and you're not going to a trade press?" And at the time, I didn't even know what a trade press was, but she said, you know, people are interested in the canal. You should write a book that's accessible, that anyone can read. And so that really changed how I thought about it and made it more of a personal mission to get more information out there. I think it's really important. And, you know, with that in mind, I would say I had trouble figuring out how to end Box 25 because, you know, I traced these men's lives, and after a nice long life, like Constantine Parkinson was 95 when he passed away, but by the end of the book, by the end of the story, they're all passing away, and I thought that's a sad way to end a book. And so since I was interested in archives, I said, well, let's think about what archives are being created today. And that was how I connected with people here who are descendants of canal workers doing the work to create new archives. And again, I got a shout out to both Fran Williams and Arcelio Hartley, who have created this amazing collaboration with the University of Florida, which has the best archive on the construction of the Panama Canal. And through that collaboration, they're conducting oral histories to try to make sure that these hidden stories get told. It's really, it's very exciting, and it allowed me to end the book on, you know, a more presentist and more hopeful note to see this work being done.
No, absolutely. And Samab's work and all the research that they've done also with the University of Florida, Georgia Smathers, has informed our renovation here at the museum. So thank you so much for all the work that you do and our ongoing collaboration. Just before we finish, I think reading Box 25 today, it feels strikingly contemporary. What connections do you see between the histories of canal workers and current global conversations about migration, labor, and belonging?
Yeah, so many connections. You know, as someone who studies labor and migration, I see a world in which more people are moving, living outside of their country or region of origin than ever before. Millions and millions of people. And when you migrate for work, you're vulnerable. Typically, there's more exploitation involved because you don't have your home and your family there. So whether it's South Asian workers in the UAE, or whether it's Salvadorans in the United States, you're lured there, you're wanted there, but then very often you're treated in a disrespectful and exploitative way. And, you know, we're facing in the US, honestly, really painful times because of the deportations, the lack of constitutional rights, etc. So sadly, the US is a great example of that. We want you workers here. We need you to pick the tomatoes, to care for the elders and the children. But no, we don't want you. And we're going to treat you horribly, detain you, deport you to someplace where you have no rights. It's just mind-boggling to me. So I care a lot about the world of migrant laborers and the challenges they face, but also the canal story is in some ways a wonderful one, because we see in this case how powerfully Caribbean workers, people of African descent, shaped Panama. You know, they made it such a richer, more wonderful country in ways that I think sometimes aren't acknowledged enough.
Absolutely, I completely agree. And they continue to shape, their legacies continue to shape our culture. And last, I wanted to ask you, what do you hope audiences from Panama take away from encountering the stories today?
Well, I hope that we've been able to give them a little sense of the drama, the agency of these workers, the challenges they face, but also some of the things they achieved, the ways they shaped this region. I hope we've made them less of a sort of a nameless mass. I hope people will read the book, and I hope think more about what it would take to build a world here in Panama or in the US where the contributions of these workers is more fully recognized. You know, I like to have sort of brainstorming sessions, and I think to brainstorm about how we would do that is a really productive thing.
Thank you so much, Julie. Thank you, everybody. It's a wonderful book. We only have 12 copies here today that we will be able to share with you later. But for now, I wanted to invite the public to ask questions. If anybody has any questions that they want to ask Dr. Julie Green. ¿Alguien tiene preguntas?
Thank you. And first of all, more than asking a question, I just really want to say thank you to Julie for the work that she's been doing, not just in Box 5, but Canal Builders and all the others, that the work that seeks to highlight these West Indian workers who came, and we here at both at SAMAP and at CGM are bent on not letting this history disappear. We find it's important both for country, but for our own, my generation, my children. They need to know it. They need to know where they came from. And so highlighting these stories is significant. It's a work that we, on a personal note, have to value. I am impressed with the work as you highlight, and especially with highlighting Constantine Parkinson, because Constantine Parkinson I read his story and I almost read my grandfather's story, because similarly, my grandfather worked for the railroad in that period of time, 1904 on, and also in an accident on the railroad, he lost a leg. And the only thing that I have regarding that, because from birth, I always knew him with this cork leg. You know all the details of it. I knew he lost a leg on an accident in railroad. But I had the privilege of delving in partly to his records. And in the short time that I was afforded to do it, scrambling to copy a few things, I made it a point to copy a letter that I saw that he had written, handwritten, in which, unlike the story of Constantine Parkinson, where it says he was given an artificial leg, my grandfather wrote to complain that he had had to purchase his first artificial leg. And he was writing to complain that he needed a replacement because it was no longer fitting. And he was requesting that they provide him that free of charge. it was impressive, and I think that's what comes out a lot in these writings, that these men who so many regarded as simply diggers, and folks may kind of relegate them as, to some extent, uneducated, undeveloped. They had sufficient education that they could actually write well, and write and argue their points and stand up for themselves. He was eventually given his artificial leg. But this is what comes out in stories like these. And I think it's so, so desperately important that both the world, but our own folks need to hear that and see it and read it and understand it. And so I thank you for doing that. There's another question I had, and it's going to slip me now, and I'm going to
Can I
probably have to come back to
interject
it.
something
Yes.
to build on what you're saying? I have a theory that Caribbean migrants were one of the most cosmopolitan and educated labor migrants in history. Part of the wonders of British imperialism, right? The British cared about education. And when you look at US history, when you look at, for example, the Harlem Renaissance, it could almost be called the Afro-Caribbean Renaissance, because Caribbeans were so important as writers, as political radicals, as artists, so important. They brought modernism and cosmopolitanism to Harlem. So
That brings me to the question then that I had, because as you do work like this, especially in times like these, what sentiment, what force do you find coming back at you at a time when there's so much tendencies to want to erase and disappear what was the reality of those folks and their participation? How does this come back at you? Because I think, for example, even as we're highlighting here what those workers did, I am thinking right now of the Panama Canal. And the Panama Canal has in its IMAX theater a movie that in 2017, when they brought in the IMAX theater, completely changed the narrative of this historical development of the canal. And the movie that had been in vogue for 30 years, maybe in the small theaters that they had, which highlighted the faces and the sceneries of all those Brazilian workers, those are no longer evident in the movie. And so there is this move that seems to all be joining forces to kind of erase that participation, erase that reality. And so you're doing something that's contrary to the trend. And so what drive back forces? What do you have to face as you do that?
well, I was speaking just for a second. As a US citizen, I mentioned a little bit about what's happening now in the US. The anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States is fundamentally built on dehumanizing immigrants. And so in that context, to talk or write anything that says immigrants are human is a radical act and a necessary act. The hard part is I have a feeling that everyone here knows that. And the challenge is to reach the people who have been so shaped by the dehumanization. I read somebody saying back when the whole anti-immigrant trend really got going in the US in the 80s, one of the great theorists of how to build this movement said, we have to never refer to them as anything except illegal aliens, because if we call them illegal aliens, people will stop thinking they're human. And it worked. you know. So at its center, my work is partly just very simple. They're human, they matter, they had lives that shaped our world, and we need to think seriously about it.
Thank you, Julie. There's a couple more questions in the audience. Yeah. First here and then there.
All right. My name is Eve. My parents are Jamaican. And there's a story my mother told us that her father came to Panama to help on the canal. And she was a little girl and he never came back. So we don't know if he's one of the 26,000 workers who died or he found another family. I got a name, Penny Cook. The Penny Cook is a white man from Scotland, and there's variations on the name. So how would I ever get to find out what happened to my grandfather?
Yeah, that's I think that's a common thing, right? Not knowing what happened. The best thing would be to see if you can find him in the personnel records of the U.S. government. So I think writing to the archive and asking if they could look for it, or hiring, the universities in St. Louis all have grad students who are trained to do that kind of research. You could pay someone probably a small amount to go to the archive and look for that person's record.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Hi, good evening, Fran. I'm Fran from the CGM Cemetery Preservation Foundation in Pan-Caribbean Sankofa, a sister organization that's focused on bringing the stories of those who we're trying to honor in death in their place of rest, to bring those stories alive, as you've talked about, Julie. Julie, I just want to thank you. I want to thank Ms. Lasso. I was born and raised on the Canal Zone, went to Latin American schools, and knew nothing about my history. Absolutely nothing. I went to the States. In college, obviously. I learned a lot more about the Panamanian history and our culture in college than I did growing up here and in high school. So I thank you for bringing to life my history and allowing me the opportunity to share as much as I can with not only my great nephews and nieces about their history, good, bad, and ugly, because it defines who we are, and it really paved the way for the person that I am today. Not only me, not only my parents, but a community. We were raised by our neighbors, the guy down the street, our pastors, our churches, and so on. And that allowed us to go to another country and survive. You learn resilience at a very, very young age. So I thank you for that. And I will continue for as long as I can to ensure that we get recognition here in Panama and globally about our West Indian culture, how we shaped a nation in so many ways. And I'm learning the other side of Panama that I didn't know growing up in a little quiet village in Pedro Miguel all my life. And the richness of the city, I'm growing. At 73, I'm learning every day. The second thing, that was on a personal note. The second thing, Julie, is Box 25, one of the work that we're doing with the University of Florida, in the preservation of the cemeteries. We do Corozal, Gatun, and Mount Hope. Mount Hope, we found that we found 7 of the contestants that wrote in and matched them to those buried in Mount Hope. So this semester, the University of Florida, as an introduction to research with the undergrads, they are taking a deeper dive into to bring into life the story of these 7 diggers or workers, depending on when they wrote their. So, you know, depending on where they were in the history of the construction or afterwards. So I'm very pleased to let you know that this is good. I think the semester ends at the end of April, that we will be presenting and we will share it with everyone. Love to get your email addresses that they can participate with the students at the University of Florida and the University of St. Lucia. In St. Lucia, where they're bringing together just the importance of graves and how they matter and how we bring these stories alive. And so I'm excited about that piece of it. And lastly, 2 years ago when we inaugurated our monument at Corozal, and Judy came down as an invited guest, and we found Constantine Parkinson's grave. And this week, I am building well, not me, but CGM and our worker that helps us, we are building a plaque, memorial, lapida, cuadro, in honor of Constantine, someone I didn't know, but represents who I am and where I came from. So thank you, Julie.
Yeah, that's very powerful. Thank you, Fran. You're really an inspiration, the work that you all are doing.
Good evening, right here. First of all, thank you for your speech and knowledge about the Panama Canal history. First of all, I would like to say that I have done a lot of research throughout many years. I worked for the Panama Canal 27 years already. And there's a lot of hidden stories like you mentioned. And one of them that have captured my attention for quite some time is that I found out that during the Jim Crow system and the construction of the canal, there was actually inside the gold roll system, Black people. And there were not many, but there were a few. They had a lot of skills, so they had these type of positions actually. But the struggles and the problems and difficulties during those years, one of them were, what line should I do when I want to get paid my salary? It's either the silver or the roll or the gold roll. So I have read many of the letters from Box 25 and some other documents that they mentioned that when they were doing the silver roll line, once they got to the window or the person that was actually giving them their salary, they said, well, you're on the wrong line. You're a gold roll, so you got to go there. And once they were there, people were actually taking him out because he was Black. So it was a huge problem for them. So I just wanted to mention that these type of problems were also involved, even if they had skills. And most of them that came from Barbados, they did have a lot of skills too. And schooling, of course. Also, mentioning the artificial limbs, that was a big business back in the construction days. Even companies of the United States were making a lot of money due to that. And, well, looking at your PowerPoint, the first image that you had, the one on the vessel full of the Barbadians, that actually inspired me and gave me impulse actually to write about that. And first of all, to see not only how they work here during the construction, but how they came from Barbados being recruited. How was that trip from Barbados to Panama? There were almost 1,000 people there aboard that vessel. So just imagine how they were sleeping for almost a week and a half, 2 weeks, depending if they didn't find any hurricanes. So that's what I want to give you. Once again, thank you. And just wanted to share those comments.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you. And you think the people of African descent who were on the gold roll were Caribbean, or could they have been African American?
There were African Americans, most of them, and just a few made it to gold roll system inside the silver system. So they had salaries that were actually gold.
Yeah, the African Americans, my sense was they were small in number, only about 100. But I had heard that the U.S. government, as you say, didn't know what the heck to do with them,
Exactly.
but created what they called the elevated silver roll for the African Americans.
Yes.
And they were one of the most likely to protest the situation. Some of them traveled to Washington, D.C. and met with the Secretary of War to protest their treatment, claiming, relying on their citizenship. We're American citizens. We have given to this country. Excuse me, we should be treated better.
Yes. Thank you.
Follow up to what you're saying. I'm sorry. Just to follow up to what you're saying. At some point, the U.S. tried very hard to not allow Black Americans coming for jobs in the Panama Canal, because as you got further on in the years, you ran into integration issues in the schools. So they were on the gold roll in salary, but they went to the Latin American schools because of segregation. So we got it every which way.
We have time for one more question, and then we'll join Dr. Julie Green for a small reception with some wine outside. And for those wanting to acquire the book, we can also do that and a signing outside. So Wendy, take it away.
You mentioned that you found personal records for 2/3 of the people on box 25. Were the other 1/3 workers from the Panama Canal construction period? Mostly the ones that you were missing. Is that so?
Yeah, well, the everyone who wrote for the competition was involved in the construction era. That was one of the parameters of the competition. So they were all workers who had worked on the construction. Yeah, and
Because the ones that left work before were on the service cars records, and those are mostly gone. Is that true?
I think there's many more records in St. Louis than what they have processed. So it's very hard it's very, very hard to find this information. And in fact, the main records they have available are what they call the death files. I don't know exactly why they gave them that name, but that holds thousands of workers. But there are many more thousand that are not part of those specific files that they've just never processed. So they need to get some work done so we can have all that. And, you know, the private companies have gotten to digitize. So you can find, actually, I should have mentioned this when you're talking about trying to find, you can search, if you go into ancestry.com, you can search for personnel records. But again, that also, they've digitized only a fraction of all the workers who worked on the canal.
Thank you very much, Julie. And I hope you all join us for some wine, some more questions, and for you to acquire box 25 with us outside and a signature from Julie.
Thank you all.